Scott, let me start with what is happening, close to the Strait of Hormuz, which is the blockade imposed by Donald Trump. And so far, what do we know about the blockade and how effective was that?
Well, I mean, it's hard to tell because we're getting conflicting reports from, the United States Central Command and the Trump administration, which is posturing this blockade as being extraordinarily effective. And there are regional outlets, very pro-American, anti-Iranian outlets, which echo this sentiment, somehow implying that traffic is just flowing freely through the Strait of Hormuz and that the Iranians no longer have control over the strait. Then we compare and contrast that with reporting out of Iran that no, they're very much in control of the strait and that they are collecting their tariffs, and only those ships that pay the tariffs are able to transit, and that there's been virtually no interruption of Iranian shipping in shipping coming from Iranian ports. So, we have conflicting narratives. I would say that I support the Iranian narrative because it seems to be more reality based. The notion, first of all, there's no American shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, so the United States doesn't have a physical presence there. So how can they dictate what happens through the strait? They're not controlling that. The implication is that by putting, some sort of picket line further out into the Gulf of Oman and into the Indian Ocean, that they're effectively interdicting illicit traffic. But the fact is, the United States can operate close to the Iranian shore and is not operating close to the Iranian shore. Their ships operate in a standoff, which creates a huge buffer zone for the transit of shipping that operates under the umbrella of Iranian missile defenses and operates outside of the span of control of the United States Navy. So, logically speaking, the narrative put forward by Central Command in the White House doesn't conform to reality. So but it's impossible to say. I've always said that this blockade is pure political theater. That it's
yeah.
We're back.
Can you hear me, Scott?
I can hear you. Yeah, there's just a little internet disruption.
You're back.
Well, I've just always said this political theater, designed to create the perception of American prowess, American power, so that Trump can more effectively engage in negotiations, which are ongoing, by the way. I mean, people should understand that there was never, Vance went home and the senior Iranian leadership went home, but left in Islamabad are technical teams that continue to pound away. And there's now talk about high-level representation falling back in on Islamabad as early as Thursday. Donald Trump is speaking about a very spectacular 2 days coming up. I just think this blockade was always an act of political theater that would allow Donald Trump to buy off on a peace plan by making the case to the American people that this peace plan was only made possible because of the American blockade. That's my opinion.
He had a phone call with Xi Jinping. He said that he's happy because I'm going to open the Strait of Hormuz. It's unbelievable because the Strait of Hormuz was open for China. They didn't have any difficulty.
No problem. The Chinese have basically told the United States to pound sand and keep their hands off a Chinese ship. But if Trump wants to take credit, look, China doesn't care. I don't think Iran cares if Trump's blustering and all that. If Trump wants to lie to the American people and the American people want to believe that lie, that's our internal domestic political problem. As far as the Iranians are concerned, the reality is the reality. And at the end of the day, there will have to be some, I guess, political compromises made on the part of Iran. And I think the Iranians are mature enough to understand this, that Trump is in a very difficult position politically right now. He got involved in a war that I think in retrospect, he wishes he never got involved in. and I smile not because on the other hand, this war has cost thousands of lives. Most of them are innocent Iranian lives, and the damage that has been done to Iran is real. It's not big, but so the smile isn't meant to belittle these horrific losses. The smile is just sort of a physiological response to the stupidity of it all. I mean, this is just really lunacy, and this president has, boxed himself into a corner, and he wants out, and there is a pathway out, but he has to make sure that this pathway can be sold to the American public as a victory for Donald Trump, and that's tough to do when there's been no victory whatsoever. I mean, the United States hasn't achieved any of its objectives. Iran has emerged from this tragic conflict stronger than ever. I mean, we keep talking about the destroyed Iranian Navy, and yet we had to acknowledge that they still have their fast boats that can lay mines, and they have submarines that can operate. We sunk, surface warfare ships that were never going to effectively challenge the United States to begin with. So we carried out a campaign, a naval campaign that has no impact on the reality that's faced, that Iran's Navy was more than just some surface ships. Iran's Navy right now has ballistic missiles and drone capabilities that allow it to control the Strait of Hormuz and project power off Iranian shores to keep the United States Navy at bay. So which Navy has won this conflict?
Do you see Donald Trump recognizing his sort of mistakes, because he had some sort of agenda, some sort of understanding, or he was, we can say he had some sort of objectives in this operation, which led to this trap, in my opinion, in the Middle East. Does he recognize that?
The internet came out, so you have to repeat the first part of that question.
Yeah, my question is, because of some sort of false assumption on the part of Donald Trump, he entered this war in the Middle East. Does he recognize those false assumptions on his part? Does he recognize his sort of role in what has happened to him?
Well, Donald Trump isn't a man that seems to be capable of much self-reflection. He's a man that suffers from sort of malignant narcissistic personality disorder. He's psychotic in that manner. He has an ego the size of the moon, and he believes he can do no wrong. So it's not about Donald Trump reflecting on the mistakes he's made. What Donald Trump is trying to do is push the mistakes off onto the shoulders of others. And there will be heads that roll because of this. Interestingly enough, it'll be curious to see how he deals with Israel, because this war was sold to Donald Trump by Benjamin Netanyahu and the head of the Israeli Mossad. And almost universally, Trump's advisors, military and civilian alike, cautioned against accepting the Israeli, assessments at face value. And today, pretty much everything the Israelis laid out turned out to be false. They said they could achieve regime change. They haven't. They said they could suppress ballistic missile launch capabilities. They couldn't. They've accomplished nothing. And so I think Donald Trump recognizes this. He, his thing is he's bought into the Pete Hegseth formulation of, massive bombardment automatically equals victory because the enemy is intimidated. And Donald Trump seems to be very frustrated and perplexed by the fact that the Iranians don't acknowledge the scope and scale of their defeat. Isn't it obvious you've been defeated? But then Donald Trump doesn't understand warfare at this point in time, because blowing up empty buildings or blowing up buildings that have civilians in them doesn't constitute victory. And the reality is we haven't destroyed much in Iran. That's just a statement of fact. And some of that's been proven. For instance, the Iranian Air Force is starting to emerge from their underground, hide facilities. We've destroyed a bunch of derelict aircraft, but the newest model of Russian helicopters, the Mi-28s, are out flying over Tehran. F-4s are flying, F-14s are flying. I haven't heard any reports of the MiGs or the Su-35s yet, but I'm sure they're there someplace. we haven't accomplished anything. Iran is producing missiles. It's not just they retain missiles; they're producing missiles as we speak. So we haven't impacted their missile production facility. What we have done is blown up a lot of facilities that had been evacuated. We blew up a lot of empty buildings, and we killed a lot of civilians because of the collateral damage or just outright bad targeting on the part of a U.S. Defense Department / War Department that was told to pursue maximum lethality and with minimum legality. It's a war crime, straight up war crime. I don't think Trump is capable of this kind of self-reflection at this point in time, though. And I don't think the U.S. establishment is capable of this. And when they do, it's not going to be about, identifying problems and coming up with solutions. It's going to be about who gets the blame, whose head's going to be put on a platter and who gets to stay.
Scott, before this war started, you remember you and I were discussing about what would be the objectives of the war, what would they do? Our understanding, because of what has happened during the 12-day war, we thought that Israel has a lot of intelligence coming out of Iran. They have a lot, they know a lot. But the outcome of what has happened so far in the second round of war, do you think they were somehow bragging to Donald Trump? Because it doesn't show that they knew where is the missile production, drone production. They're just hitting civilians.
Yeah, I think first of all, intelligence isn't static. Okay, I've done it for a long time. You may have, if I'm collecting, I do a collection management plan. I'm given a problem. The way intelligence work is supposed to work is that the leadership identifies a problem. A problem is identified to them, and they're looking for solutions. And so a question is posed, can Iran produce missiles of a certain range? Or, how does Iran plan to safeguard missile production? Or, where is Iranian leadership? These questions are posed. And then my job as intelligence officer is take that question and then break it down into specific components. How do I, what the sub questions are. And then as I do that, then I have to do an assessment and say, okay, what are the essential elements of information to answer this? And how do I collect that information? If I have a question, what assets and resources do I use? And so I'll come up with a collection management plan that puts human resources, technical resources, imagery resources, all that on this problem. And then I start collecting information. And as I collect information, I can refine my assessments. I can ask new questions. I can, but if you do a good job, you should come up with an answer. And, then you brief your boss. Now the boss will ask follow-on questions but understand that just because you got it right the first time, I've done this before. I've gone before and I've nailed it. Boom, brief the 4-star general. This is it, baby. But then you got to stay on track. You can't allow yourself to pat yourself on the back and rest on your laurels because things move. As I'm collecting, for instance, the enemy, the target, if they're smart, they're changing the way they do things just as a matter of course. They're listening to, what's being said. Unfortunately, in the West, if you make politicians feel comfortable about something, they tend to talk about it. And they don't talk directly, they talk indirectly, but the hostile forces are listening and they're saying, they're on to something here. Let's change what we're doing. And if I'm not doing my job, keeping the net out there, doing my job, monitoring the change, come back going, hey, boss, the thing I told you last week, I don't think we can be so solid anymore because it looks like the Iranians have done this, that, and the other thing. They might be moving in this direction. Boom, boom, boom. But see, once I get the problem with the intelligence community is they're not like me. I don't give a flying you-know-what. I'll tell you what the facts are. And I've been fired before. General Schwarzkopf fired me in the middle of the Gulf War because I told him the uncomfortable truth. I won't massage data to make the boss happy. I will tell the boss what it is. And if it makes him unhappy, that's his problem, not my problem. Except I got fired. They rehired me because they knew I was right, but it doesn't matter. But unfortunately, there's people today who view this as if they don't make their boss happy, they don't get promoted. If they don't get promoted, their career's over. And so once you positively brief the boss, you want to keep the boss happy. So they keep telling the boss the same lie, or they keep shaping data to reinforce that assessment, which made the boss happy. And what happens is the difference between the theory, the fiction they're selling and reality becomes so, the gap becomes huge. And that's where we're at today. I think after June, the Israelis had some good insight into the Iranians. I mean, they had collection plans in place. But then what happened is they rested on their laurels. And the Iranians, on the other hand, had to change everything. I mean, what do you do when you find out that the Mossad has built drone factories on your own soil that have been there for a long time? I mean, you don't simply go there and shut down the drone factory. You have to sit there and go, how the hell did this happen? It's just a systemic dysfunction within our system. We have to change everything. But the Mossad sitting there going, we had drone factories and we were doing some cool stuff with the drones, and everybody's patting themselves on the back how good they are. And that what they don't realize is the Iranians are changing the whole game on them, just redefining how things work. And if you're not in there moving this stuff, and the Iranians rolled up a bunch of networks, and then the Israelis said, well, we got a backup network. Yeah, but the backup network wasn't doing what this network was doing. There's a gap. The point is, I think the Israelis became too cocky, too confident, and the Iranians did the appropriate things. I mean, history will show if they ever talk about it. We'll find out about this. But the Iranians shuffled the deck, so to speak, which means now the Israelis had an imperfect assessment. That the assessment that Trump received from Netanyahu and the Mossad chief on February 11th was an assessment that may have been valid in June, July, maybe August, but it started to get dated in September, October, November. And then they really got cocky again because of the demonstrations. And so they focused on that. They didn't realize the Iranians are on top of everything. The president got briefed on bad intelligence. Bad assessments derive from bad intelligence and incomplete understanding. And I think that's where we're at today. We don't have a clue what Iran's doing. I mean, a smart person should be able to reverse engineer what has happened and come up with appropriate conclusions. The problem is when you do that, you oftentimes come with an assessment that is so far removed from the assessment that has originally briefed the boss. And it becomes politically difficult to come in front of the boss and say, everybody was wrong. Because how do you do that? I mean, if you're a junior analyst and you're good, this is not rocket science. This is easy. Reverse engineering, this is the simplest thing in the world. But now you have to come to your boss and say, you were wrong. And the boss is sitting there already spending last year's bonus that he got because he was supposedly so good and looking forward to his new promotion and the vacation that comes with the promotion. And now the boy that works for him comes in and says, you were wrong. And we got to go and tell your boss that you were wrong. Nobody wants to do that. So they say, well, Ritter, let me see what you got here. Hey, Anderson. They bring over Anderson, who's a good ass-kissing yes boy. Take a look at these facts. Anderson comes back, Scott's overemphasizing this, and they start to smother the assessments. And so then what happens is maybe a little bit comes up here so they can blame this person, deflect onto this person, but you never get the comprehensive relook that needs to happen. That's what happens when you have politicized intelligence. And the U.S. intelligence community is 100% politicized. We don't know how to tell the truth anymore. We don't have people who are willing to put it all on the line in defense of solid intelligence assessments.
Scott, how did Iranian attacks on American bases in the region influence the gathering of intelligence? Because we know when the war has started, Donald Trump said he was surprised by the Iranian attack on GCC countries. But part of that, they were attacking radars, and part of that was attack on CIA and Mossad offices in the region. How did that influence the whole concept of gathering information?
Well, I mean, it complicates it. I mean, you have resources. I think the human intelligence dimension, was severely disrupted, but it was always going to be because you know, you have peacetime human intelligence collection, which operates under completely different rules than wartime human intelligence collection. So I think by targeting the Mossad and the CIA, capabilities, it didn't have that much of an impact because we had already transitioned into wartime collection, which is different, more technical in nature. And hopefully from the Iranian perspective, they took that into consideration. But the thing about war is that, look, Iran has to do things. I don't want to give away too much here, but I mean, you do things in wartime that are predictable. And because they're predictable, for instance, I, as a military professional, could do things that make Iran respond. It's called shaking the tree. And then I will have my capabilities focused on the fruit that's dropping from the tree. And because it's war, Iran doesn't have too much time to be cute. They're going to be doing stuff. So if you're focused doing the right things, if you're focused on the right things, if you know your enemy's capabilities, if you know how they communicate, I can be very effective in my intelligence collection. Now, I have to be on the ball because everyday things change. But the point is, if we really were doing solid intelligence collection, we should know a whole bunch about how Iran operates. The problem is our political leaders don't want to know how Iran operates. They've bought into a fiction, and they have to keep this fiction. Nobody has the balls to go before the president and say everything you were told was a lie. Nobody has the balls to do that. Stand before the president and say everything you were told were a lie, and everything you've done is based upon a lie, and you have to fix it, Mr. President. There's not a single person in the U.S. intelligence community or policy community has the courage to tell the president that to his face. They'll be fired on the spot. They won't be allowed into the White House. And so we don't have people doing effective intelligence anymore because that intelligence is politically impossible to move up the chain. And so people like me who would be doing that are fired or relieved or reassigned. Counting ping pong balls in Alaska instead of, doing what they're supposed to do, because these assessments, you can't do a blockade of Iran with a good intelligence telling you that will never work. Nobody wants to hear that will never work. What they want to hear is, oh, this is a good idea. And they sell the fiction. Everything about how this war has been operated is based upon foundational lies, mistruths, miscalculations that are done deliberately to disguise the fact that the original assessment given to the president was bogus, was a lie. Nobody wants the truth right now. Nobody wants the truth. And as a result, look, the Iranians came loaded for bear to this Islamabad thing with the facts. I would have loved to have been able to sit down with the Iranians and go through those facts as a policy person and sit there and take their facts because, I'm confident that I could get. Look, you and I have talked about this issue before, about 60% enriched uranium and all that stuff. I would have the Iranians compelled to admit that was a bad idea and they don't need the stuff and they're going to get rid of it. That's an easy discussion to have.
I think they said that. They're not going to.
Yeah, they've already acknowledged that. And they would acknowledge it again. But, we have to come in with the enrichment's okay. You get to enrich the 3.5%, but because of the 60% issue, we have to shut down in perpetuity your ability to go to 60% again. That can't be allowed. That's not going to be allowed. We have to monitor against it and all that kind of stuff. In exchange, you get all the sanctions lifted. You get all the
and it's a huge technical, sort of negotiation. It's not
100%
about
technical negotiation. But it's doable. It's doable. But in order to do that, you have to stop the stupidity. On our side, when you allow Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to front, and they don't understand when Araghchi comes in and says, we got 490 pounds of this stuff or kilograms of this stuff, they go, he's threatening us with 10 nuclear weapons. No, what he was telling you is Iran hasn't further enriched. Iran hasn't done this, that it's all there ready. It's there. It's ready to be turned over. That's what he was telling the United States. But our morons are sitting there going, no, you're threatening us with nuclear weapons. Iran's not threatening anybody with nuclear weapons. Iran is saying we have this capability. And this is what it is. This is the reality of it. But we're not ready to have that technical discussion. I don't think we have people capable of having that technical discussion because you have to empower them politically. And right now, nobody in Washington, D.C. wants to empower the truth. It's the same thing with the Strait of Hormuz. It's an easy problem to solve. It's a very simple problem to solve. And it's one in which I believe the Iranians, if you were politically responsible, I believe we could get Iran to agree to a 10-year window of tariff or tolls so that it's not permanent. So you're not threatening international law and the sea and all that stuff, but you recognize the inherent right of the need for security guarantees. Continued Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz is a security guarantee that must be recognized as valid given the fact that the United States and Israel carried out an illegal war of aggression and a surprise attack. You can't expect Iran to give up its leverage. And the fact that the Gulf Arab states directly or indirectly supported this attack means that they too have to pay a price. But we can couch this in terms of, there's a mechanism that can come into play where it's about reconstruction, or something that there's a way to spin this so that Iran gets what it needs politically, but it's not sold as an American defeat, which is important, politically important. I know there's all the non-Americans are out there saying, pound sand, we don't care. Well, you know what? Then you'll never get a solution to the problem, right? This isn't about the humiliation of the United States. This is about finding a good off-ramp that gets this war over so the people of Iran can operate free of economic sanctions, free of international constraint. They can finally get the economy they deserve and get the investments in their, this is all good for the people of Iran if this can happen. To happen, Trump has to be able to do this politically. Right now, I don't think the United States is capable of empowering the right people at this point, but we'll see, because it sounds like Trump is. There are technical people they're aware of everything you and I are just talking about right now, and I'm sure they have put forward working papers that have made their way to the president, and that's why he sounds optimistic about some big breakthrough come Thursday. We'll see, because this is Donald Trump, and you just never know what's going to happen. But I just think that Trump wants out of this war. I think he recognizes that mistakes have been made, but now it's a political question. How do you if there was no politics involved, this war would be over today. But because there's politics involved that are colored by an upcoming midterm election, which is all about the political legacy of Donald Trump, everything now has to go through a political filter, and it just complicates things so much.
Yeah. We had J.D. Vance participating in TPUSA, which was confronted by some people that are talking about you're supporting genocide. And J.D. Vance wants to. I think he wants to be 2028 presidential candidate for Republicans. How do you see the way that he was negotiating with Iranians? Because they said from the Iranian side, I talked with Professor Moran, they said right in the middle of the night, it was late in the night, he decided to go to the United States, which he agreed before to negotiations continuing to Sunday, but he decided to get out. What was that, Scott? What was that? And he was calling over and over Washington. He talked with Benjamin Netanyahu, and Benjamin Netanyahu says he was in direct contact with him because he wanted to report what has happened. What is that?
Well, it's a reality that in the Trump administration, there's no such thing as an independent negotiator. The only voice that counts is Donald Trump. This isn't Richard Nixon giving Henry Kissinger, permission to run off and solve problems, and then report back, and the president's briefed on it. Kissinger has great latitude. J.D. Vance had zero latitude to the fact that there was almost Islamabad memorandum of understanding is solely because of the Iranians, who came in prepared, very well prepared, and they were able to, take whatever limited American input there was and immediately turned it into something. They were ready to move. It's a shame that we blew that opportunity. But J.D. Vance wasn't there to, in my opinion, he wasn't there to make a deal. He was there to make it impossible for a deal to take place. The reason he left at midnight is because the Iranians were doing everything they could to make a deal. The Iranians were ready. They're like, let's get this thing done. Here it is. You got a problem? Here's a solution. You got a problem? Here's a solution. We're ready to do what it takes to get this thing done. And Vance wasn't allowed to close the deal, so he had to leave. Because this can't be, if J.D. Vance closed the deal, if there was a successful negotiation, this could only be interpreted as an Iranian victory. That the United States met Iran in Islamabad, and at the end of the day, the Iranian 10 points served as the foundation of this of this agreement. That's politically unacceptable. So what had to happen is we had to go in there, engage with the Iranians, and then declare the negotiations over because of Iranian intransigence, back out. Now that gives room for Donald Trump to go through the political theater of a blockade that is paid. And it allows him to declare victory, which he has done. And now he can go in and close the deal and say it only happened because of the great strength and resolution that I showed in showing the Iranians who's the boss of the Strait of Hormuz. But now we've solved that, so now we're going to have reconstruction. It's a great source of revenue, and however he wants to spin it. But J.D. Vance just wasn't allowed to succeed. I don't think some people say that's because Trump,
Yeah, we've lost.
I think some people said it was about Trump trying to sabotage Vance. I don't think it's that. I just think that, it was about Trump making sure that at the end of the day, the failure of the negotiations couldn't be put on his table. It had to be put on somebody's table. And it leaves room for him to ride in and save the day, which I think you're going to see tomorrow. I think tomorrow is going to be an interesting day diplomatically.
Yeah, today we've learned the Pakistani Army Chief Asim Munir, he has arrived in Tehran, with a senior political and security delegation. He's sending, he's giving the message from Washington to Iranians. Do you think that this time around, as you mentioned, Iranians were there, they went to Pakistan totally prepared. You see, you look at the delegation, they had everything there. They had an economy, legal, political, everything. They had everything there to do everything correctly. But how do you see, if something happens with the negotiation, with the talk, do you see the same happening on the part of the United States? We see a good delegations having each and every dimension that a delegation need to negotiate, to talk.
I don't know if we're capable of that anymore. I mean, I'd like to believe we could, but I don't know if we're capable of that anymore. What I see is that we were intellectually lazy. We let the Iranians do all the hard work. That we'll use the Islamabad draft MOU as the foundation. It's been sent back, and there's been some tinkering with it. I think, when we meet, we're going to use that document as the foundation. Look, I would love if we sent in a senior diplomat who was backed by, all the experts in the U.S. community coming together to do the same thing that the Iranians did. We don't have that kind of capability anymore. The State Department's been gutted. Donald Trump's approach to national security and foreign policy, formulation and implementation is to remove all the middlemen. So we don't have technical experts anymore. We don't have people that are singularly focused on this issue from a policy perspective. So I think the team we come in is going to be a politically motivated team there to save Donald Trump's presidency, and it's about spin. That Iran has done all the technical heavy lifting, and the United States is. I think we're just going to send another team of political spin meisters. Let's see. We'll see what it looks like. I think that the Pakistani defense minister was also there to because the Iranians were concerned the U.S. was going to shoot them down, that the U.S. was going to do something stupid. And I think the Pakistanis have to reassure the Iranians that they're not being set up for a U.S. trap.
That's so strange, publishing articles, that this is an opportunity to kill Iranian negotiators. It's unbelievable. You have to be totally out of your mind to suggest that. The guy who wrote that article, because nobody would believe any sort of negotiations if something of that sort happens. This is the Israeli sort of agenda, because they have been killing and assassinating the negotiator. That the United States cannot be like this. I don't believe the United States is like this.
This administration is. This administration is unapologetic about everything. They're capable of anything. I mean, that's just where we are. This administration has modeled itself after the Israelis in terms of behavior. So I wish if we had this conversation 6 months ago, I would have said the same thing you did. That's not how America operates. I can't say that anymore. I mean, look, Donald Trump killed Qasem Soleimani. The American people still don't know the truth about that murder. This was a guy who was acting at the request of regional players to, create peace opportunities. He was on a mission of peace, of diplomacy, which is why he traveled openly in the way that he did. And we murdered him as he was trying to, coordinate nonviolent solutions to problems that previously had only been, sought to be solved violently. And we murdered the guy. Trump that murdered him. And so we are fully capable of doing Israeli type actions.
You mentioned, Scott, it seems that still in the mind of those people who are the main decision makers in the United States, in Israel, is that this government is an ideological government. They are radical, and nobody sees the pragmatic, sort of attitude of the government in Iran. I would say there is nothing radical with the government. If you know the people, if you talk to the people, if you see the way that they're seeing the conflict, the war, so far, look at this war, more than 40 days of the war. There is nothing radical about them, nothing ideological. They didn't attack civilians because in the first day, a primary school was attacked by by the fighter jets. They didn't go because they know what they want. They know what is practical for them. And they fail to understand it in the United States, in my opinion, and in Israel as well.
No, look, we're dealing with people who are incapable of the truth, of embracing the truth. Why did the Iranian regime survive the assassination of Ali Khamenei? In the West, we think of it as a government of extreme theocrats. The Ayatollahs are in charge, but they're not. Iran's a constitutional republic. The president's in charge. Read the Constitution. The president has a lot of power. Even when you get into these various councils and committees, the president is the chair of these. He's the man that's sitting at the head of the table. Yes, the supreme leader is there, but the supreme leader is there from a religious standpoint, to focus on ensuring that policies conform, to the Islamic, foundation of the nation. But the Constitution drives everything. Even the Guardian Council and the Expediency Council are there to ensure, constitutional conformity. This is a system that's been in play for 5 decades, and it works. And the Iranian people, by and large, believe in it. There are abuses of power, of course there are, but for people to say this is a regime of mad radical Ayatollahs means you don't know anything about Iran. You don't understand how Iran works. You don't understand how Iran functions. The total disrespect you show to the Majlis. And the whole concept of democracy, democratic representation, etc. And so, we can't allow people who truly know Iran to be advising the president, because the only way these policies work is if you believe the underlying misinformation about Iran and its system of government. But there's nothing radical about Iran. I think what we've done is we've empowered a more conservative element that is distrustful of the West, that might be more inclined to pivot away from the West and engage more fruitfully with the East. But even then, remember, the people that are talking about the pivot, it's not as though they're sold out to China and Russia. These are Iranian patriots. We don't respect the fact that the people that are governing Iran today are Iranian patriots first and foremost, that they're looking out for what's best for Iran, that one of the reasons why they've rejected, the policies of Rouhani and Zarif, is because the West has betrayed Iran so much over time. The West can't be trusted. And so they're starting to question those who believe we should give the West one more chance. To do what? to betray Iran again. So we in the West, we don't want to legitimize the legitimate concerns of these more conservative Iranians. So we radicalize them instead. We make anything that's opposition to the United States and the West becomes radicalized. And then we tend to, ignore the patriotic aspects of these people, and we call them Islamists, radical Islamists, fundamentalists, extremists, when the reality is most of them aren't extreme. I mean, none of them are extreme. I mean, I believe that Iran is a nation of great faith, and I believe that people who gravitate to positions of leadership, because it is an Islamic republic, are people whose beliefs conform with the vision of an Islamic republic, but that doesn't make them Islamists or fundamentalists or extremists in the way that we use those terms to define Wahhabism, Salafism, Al Qaeda, ISIS, and things of that nature. We in the West, we're incapable of discerning differences, or maybe we're capable of it. We just don't want to, because the truth is complex, and we want simplicity. And so we embrace lies. We embrace, inaccurate narratives because it's easier to do so, because we're not trying to win a debate about the reality of Iran with Iranians. It's not like, I don't have to convince you. I have to convince the idiot American across the street from me, and the idiot American down the road from me, and the idiot American down here, people who are ignorant about it. So the narrative I create doesn't have to be fact-based or conform to reality. It just has to be something that can be consumed readily by an ignorant American public. And that's got to be frustrating for you and the people of Iran, who are saying, well, wait a minute, we really exist. There's a truth here. There's a reality here. Sadly, in America, we don't care about your truth or your reality. We only care about how we can spend data so that it can be consumed politically here in the United States.
Part of the negotiations, Scott, since day one, Iran said on all fronts, there has to be, they have to put an end to the war on all fronts. One of them is with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And Israel had the first, direct talks with Lebanese government. But the outcome of that, it seems to be, they're going to end up having a civil war in Lebanon if they go in that direction. What is your understanding of that?
My understanding is that Israel currently occupies 22% of Lebanon. So any Lebanese government that negotiates with the Israelis without recognizing that isn't a Lebanese government. They're an adjunct of Israel. And this is the fact. The Lebanese constitution, the vagaries of the French-imposed system of guaranteeing the presidency to a Christian and the prime ministership to a Sunni Muslim. That means that there's no real democracy. It means that Lebanon is governed by factions, and the Christian faction and the Sunni faction, at least as they are represented in government, are factions that have sold out to Israel. They are controlled by Israel. So when we speak of Israel negotiating with the Lebanese government, it's Israel negotiating with itself. The Lebanese government's incapable of doing the notion that though, Hezbollah, which derives its legitimacy from the very concept of resistance to Israeli occupation, that Israel can't defeat Hezbollah, so they're turning to the Lebanese to say, you have to disarm Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. So the Lebanese army, instead of confronting the foreign entity that occupies 22% of their soil, is slaughtering their people, is now supposed to turn on Hezbollah? That isn't going to happen. The army won't obey those orders because the army understands what the consequences will be. The army cannot defeat Hezbollah in a stand-up fight. And if they try, it'll become a civil war. And when it becomes a civil war, suddenly the politics that constrain Hezbollah will no longer exist. And you'll see a different Hezbollah. Hezbollah is more powerful than the Lebanese army. And they're more powerful than the Israeli army when it comes to defending Lebanese soil. And Hezbollah will not be defeated. What we're seeing right now is just it's a game being played by the United States and Lebanon to create perceptions. How this will impact the final peace negotiations, I can't speak for the Iranians. I would never seek to speak for the Iranians, and I can't speak for the United States because I'm not in a position to do so. But I do believe that if I were an American negotiator, that I could prevail upon the Iranians to recognize the fact that the Israeli-Hezbollah conflict cannot be lumped into the current conflict between Israel and the United States and Iran. That these are two separate issues. That that doesn't mean we're going to give carte blanche to Israel to act, but we have to recognize the reality that we're not going to solve the Lebanese problem today. And therefore we must push it off under a different format. We can extend the ceasefire. We can seek a permanent cessation of hostilities between the United States and Iran, and extend the ceasefire, understanding that, we can't guarantee outcomes here. I think that's a responsible way. The first of all, that is a format that doesn't require Iran to stop funding Hezbollah, which Iran isn't going to do. So I think by treating those as separate, and same thing with the Houthi. I mean, there's still the unresolved issues between the Houthi and Saudi Arabia that that conflict hasn't come to an end yet. And I still think that I could sit down with the Iranians and say we have to treat Yemen as a separate issue as well. We need to solve our fundamental problem. All right. But these issues are far more complex. They involve players that are outside the framework of our conflict. And, so we need to come up with an effective mechanism of continuing engagement to resolve these conflicts without, and I would tell the Iranians, without forestalling your ability to move forward. I want sanctions lifted against Iran. I would say that as an American negotiator. I want those sanctions lifted. We can't lift those sanctions if we're tying in Yemen and Lebanon, because now these problems aren't going to be solved overnight. If we're tying them in, that means this thing's going to drag out forever. We need to conclude our problems so that you can get sanctions lifted, so we can, move on with doing whatever we have to do in the region. And we need to agree that we're all going to come in. Now, maybe we can talk about frameworks. Maybe we can get Chinese mediators. Maybe we can do some things about this, to change the dynamic. Because if I were the Iranians, I'd say, well, so you're just proposing we continue to do what we did before that didn't work. It only led to Israeli attacks and American attacks on Yemen and Lebanon. So there would be, I think it would be wise to talk about bringing in, other parties to facilitate these negotiations, the Chinese, the Russians, et cetera, to de-emphasize the American. How stupid of it is to have the United States, together Lebanon and Israel to negotiate the future of Hezbollah. I mean, it's just ridiculous framing. Anyways, that's that.
And Hezbollah is not Hamas. Hezbollah is something beyond that. Everybody knows the role of Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Hezbollah defeated the Israelis in 2000. They fought the Israelis to a standstill in 2006, and they're beating the Israelis today. So, Hezbollah is Hezbollah. It's not going away anytime soon.
Scott, I think the war in the Middle East has somehow changed the whole calculations on the part of Russia, China, Europe, because after the war in Ukraine, which was a total blow to European economy, they have been suffering a lot because of the war in Ukraine. And then the war in the Middle East came along. And you see how they are suffering as time goes by with this war in the Middle East from what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, for example. And how do you see the way Donald Trump tried to put pressure on Saudi Arabia? This is the first time I've seen the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia says, no, we're going to decide about our policy. Our policy would be based on our calculation, not the calculation of the Trump administration. I have never seen Saudi Arabia talking this way. And how do you see the influence or the way that the influence that the war has had on calculation of GCC countries?
I mean, we have a study in contrasts. We have Saudi Arabia that appears to be more reality-based and saying, we get to make these decisions. Yeah, the United Arab Emirates was purely, a tool of the United States. I mean, they sent a senior delegation to China to try and put pressure on China to drop their support for Iran. And I've never seen more public humiliation in my entire life when the Chinese put the UAE delegation in its place. You don't tell the dragon what to do. The reality is that the world has changed, and the United States is can no longer project itself as this, this superpower, the last remaining superpower, unchecked guarantor of security, that nobody would dare challenge the United States because of our overwhelming military and economic strength. And now we have today the reality that Iran successfully stood up the United States militarily, and the United States hasn't broken them economically, that the world is a far more complicated, nuanced place with strengths having been accrued in China, Russia, and elsewhere that the United States can't overcome. The Gulf Arab nations, which had for now, 40 decades, bought into the Carter Doctrine, which was, America guarantees security, but then you guarantee your foreign policies will align with the United States. There There we go. They're waking up to the fact that they're waking up to the fact that the United States no longer gets to dictate outcomes, and it can no longer provide guarantees, and so they have to adjust to this. Some adjust more rapidly than others. I think Saudi Arabia is starting to see the light, and the United Arab Emirates continues to wallow in its own ignorance.
Let's assume they get something with the negotiations between Iran and the United States. Is that going to be a new era of cooperation between the United States and other countries?
The United States is incapable of cooperating with other countries under Donald Trump. So I think you're going to see that this negotiation is the exception, not the rule. The only way the United States is going to come up with significant policy deviations that could be called, trending towards the normal is by defeat. If the United States isn't challenged, then we will continue to do what we've been doing, the path of least resistance, et cetera, under the belief that, America can get away with literally anything. But as we are challenged and as we fail, we have to adapt. And I think Iran is the first of what will probably be many adaptations that will take place over the course of the next several years. But this isn't the United States learning how to get along with its neighbors. It's the United States being compelled by the weight of their failures to readjust.
Yeah. Thank you.
Allah जाने कितने साथ छोड़ा मैं चम चम तारों तुम्हारे पाप दादी छोड़ा मैं चम चम तारों में फेरा दुख नसीराने पीछे पर देखा बाप ने चला करा किसी हाथ में चम चम अल्लाह जाने मौला जाने कितने साल छोड़ा मैं चम चम तारों तुम्हारे पीरे दादी छोड़ा मैं चम चम तारों सोने दिया तारा वो पीछे पर देखा बाबुले बने बने देवे में मारा में चम चम अल्लाह जाने मौला जाने कितने साल छोड़ा मैं चम चम तारों तुम्हारे पाप दादी थोड़ा में चम चम हेलो 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 चेक चेक हेलो 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 चेक हेलो 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 काट रुको हेलो हेलो चेक हेलो 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 ठीक हेलो 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 चेक
अरे क्यों चढ़े सारा यार इतने दे यार उतर जाओ सारा स्टेज पे सारा थले उतरो नामागा फिर चाहिए
जी हम इसके ऊपर बैठेगा तार मिसिंग करे ना हल्ला लगो बैठ दे तब एक बार ओए पीछे जाओ ओए बच्चा बाहर आ जाओ बाहर जाओ चलो 10 बार बाहर जाओ 2 मिनट में खेले एक बार बाहर नहीं चलो नशा बार पीछे आ जाओ बैठो चलो उधर जाओ तार मिसिंग करे मेरा लगती बार बार इसमें तार मिसिंग हाथ थोड़ी हरकत देखी नहीं मिस्टेक हुई एनु मोल्डिंग में फिर मेरा हाथ है ना मोल्डिंग थोड़ा दी थोड़ा ना किसको बेस
मस्तानिया वो पानिया